One of the interesting things to me about the role of the NASD in self-regulation is that it takes a long time to pass a law. It takes a little bit less time to pass a regulation. But a self-regulatory organization can move more quickly than the regulatory cycle and can make changes that the market needs through the consensus of the participants, rather than waiting for a regulation or waiting for a law. So I think there's a speed issue there that's very valuable to be able to change the game as the game changes around you.
A valid observation to a point. And that point is that every rule and regulation that the NASD, which is now called FINRA,
Financial Industry Regulatory
Authority, has to be approved. Every rule or regulation they adopt has to be approved by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And that was part of our frustration. We could act quickly. And if we had a supportive commission, which we did in my early years there, then we could get things done quickly, like making the changes in 1987 that needed to be changed in order to enhance the quality of the market. But if you had a commission that was not quite as supportive, they could sit on those proposed rules and regulations for years. And that happened on several occasions, much to the detriment of the market. And I'm talking about having, for instance, an audit trail. We proposed building an audit trail for all securities transactions in the NASDAQ market in 1994. The SEC didn't act on it until after 2000, I think in 2002 was after mine. So they sat on that for a number of years. Well, having an audit trail of every transaction that takes place enhances your regulatory capability.
Yeah.
And so you can quickly see what was unfolding in the marketplace.
Yeah. Joe, NASDAQ became a brand, a known household word while you were there. What happened?
Well, following the events of 1987, the market crash, and then the enhancements we made to the market that we've talked about, the internal staff of the NASD started looking at it and said, okay, we've got what we think is a good product now, and a product that people should feel comfortable using. And we're looking at it as a business now for the first time. We're starting, this is a real business.
As opposed to a service.
As opposed to a service, as opposed to a public service. It's a real business. And we said, okay, if it's a business, first of all, let's separate it from the NASD and run it as a business. And then secondly, let's see what we can do about making people comfortable and, first of all, aware and then comfortable with the NASDAQ stock market. So we spun out NASDAQ into its own legal entity, a taxable entity. Before that, it had been a non-taxable subsidiary of the NASD, which was also a tax-exempt entity. And so we said, all right, tax-paying entity, business, money-making. Now we've got a good product. We've got to tell the world about it. So for the first time, I think, in the history of markets, we hired a marketing guy. And he was a brilliant marketing guy, as it turned out. His name was Brian Holland. And he had come out of the advertising industry. And he said, well, the first thing we've got to do is go out and find out what people think of us. So if we spent a year working with some survey firms and some advertising firms conducting surveys of various types on what people thought of the NASDAQ stock market. And what we learned, lo and behold, was a lot of them didn't even know what the NASDAQ stock market was, you know? So we said, okay, we've got to start an advertising program that's going to brand the NASDAQ stock market. So he did an initial survey of a group of, I think, about 1,000 MIPs, managers, executives, and professionals. And the question that was asked of them was, name a stock market. First one, 87% of them named New York Stock Exchange. 37% of them named the American Stock Exchange. Only 20% at that time, this was 1991, only 20% named the NASDAQ stock market. We said, wow, these are managers, executives, and professionals. These aren't small investors down here. So, following the results of that survey, we gave Brian the first marketing budget that NASDAQ had ever had. And he hired an advertising firm, and we created an advertising program, which we then showed to our member firms. And these are the securities firms from all over the country. And they said, well, we don't want you running an advertising program because that's going to hurt the New York Stock Exchange. So we're not going to provide the funding for it. So we said, okay. By that time, NASDAQ had been very well accepted by the leading companies in the technology world.
The Intels, the Ciscos,
the Intels, the Ciscos, the Microsofts, the Apples, the Suns, the MCIs, all of which were leading NASDAQ companies. So we went to them and we said, we've got this program that we want to brand the NASDAQ stock market. You guys believe in what we're doing. You're listed in our marketplace. If we increased your listing fees, not dramatically, but sufficient to fund this advertising program, and featured your companies in that ad, would you provide the financial support to do that? And to a company, they said yes. That we believe in what you're doing. We believe in screen-based markets. We believe in how the NASDAQ stock market is growing and is the future of stock markets. And we will provide that funding. So with their funding and their full support, we started running 1 to 2 minute ads, basically most of them 1 minute ad, 30 seconds, focusing on companies, Apple, Microsoft, MCI, Intel, 30-second blurb on what they do. And where do you find companies like these? The NASDAQ stock market, the market for the next 100 years. So we branded ourselves as the market of the future with the companies that were beginning to drive America's economy,
right.
The technology companies.
Right.
And then we went back and resurveyed after we ran that program for a year. We resurveyed the same managers, executives, and professionals. The results were startling. Now, 87% still think New York Stock Exchange, when you ask them to name one. Secondly, 81%, up from 20%, named the NASDAQ stock market. And the American stock market was down in the low 20s by that stage of the game. So through the power of advertising and branding, we were able to create NASDAQ as a nationally or indeed internationally known name in the business of stock exchanges.
Well, it's actually one of the most interesting marketing case studies that I know of. It's profound, actually, because you created trust.
With awareness comes acceptance. With acceptance comes trust. And that's exactly what happened with the NASDAQ stock market. And as a result, not only did our leading companies stay with us instead of migrating to the New York Stock Exchange, which has been the history of industrial America, but we were able to attract all the young healthcare companies, all the
young technology companies.
The so-called, what we call the gazelles, that were driving increasingly in the 90s and the 2000s the American economy, rather than the elephants, which were the behemoths that were listed on the New York Stock Exchange, which were slumbering a bit.
It's a great story. Thank you so much.
Well, Brian Holland deserves a lot of the credit. But so does a guy named Al Berkeley, who came along in 1995, and I hired him out of Alex Brown because I knew of his abilities. I knew of his knowledge of the technology world, and I also knew that we had to take the technology of NASDAQ, which had been based upon the old mainframe concepts developed in the 60s and 70s, into the world of servers and the new technologies, eventually cloud computing, but at that time servers. And I knew the right guy to do that. So I hired him as the president and COO of the NASDAQ Stock Market.
Thank you for doing that.
Thank you for coming on board.